please use the word icon at the bottom of the Zoom menu and choose the language of your preference.
Welcome to the conversation with finance ministers of Latin America and the Caribbean in the fiscal program. This is an event open to the public and has simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. For those of you who are with us on Zoom, go to the lower part of your screen. You can see the icon of the world and you can choose the language of your choice. We have
Vice President for countries as the moderator. Ms. Gonzalez, the microphone is yours.
Bien, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you. Good morning and thank you for being here and joining us in the 59th. I was shocked when I realized it was the 59th meeting of the network of central banks and finance ministers of the IDB. It is a pleasure for me to have this chance to chair the second open session of this event entitled A Conversation with Finance Ministers. And to begin, I'd like to introduce our panel this morning. We have Daniel Falcone, Vice Minister of Finance of Ecuador. Welcome, Daniel. Also, we have Mr. Marlon Ochoa, the Finance Minister from Honduras. Welcome, Marlon. Carlos Fernandez, the Finance Minister from Paraguay. Carlos, welcome. And we have with us virtually Mr. Jonathan Mencos from Guatemala. Hello, Jonathan, who will join us. And Minister Nigel Clark from Jamaica will be joining us in a minute. To begin the agenda, we have destined 10 minutes to each one of the ministers to share an update with us on the programs of their countries. And then we will begin a conversation on the basis of some questions, depending on the time we have. To begin, I'd like to offer the floor to Vice Minister Daniel Falcone, and I remind you that you can speak in any language that is comfortable for you. I'm sorry, we cannot hear. Okay, that's better. Good morning, Anabel, and thank you to the IDB for this invitation, and greetings to those who are here in the panel and to those who are seeing us. I think that we as Ecuador representatives should update the way our country looks now, and I think that for this we should consider the dynamics that we like to communicate, and that it be seen from the point of view of the accumulation of many of the events we've had to face for some time now. The exogenous, the shocks have set a series of constant challenges, but we've also had to identify the decision of economic policy matrices has evolved in time. So Ecuador, after the end of the macro cycle of the commodity prices, faces a pretty different reality. And it's almost 10 years that we've had to deal with a series of economic policy decisions that model an economy that adapts to a post-oil boom period. And that's probably one of the most important challenges we've had, even in the initial situation of the planning that started in 2015, where there were need to go to an interesting situation until 2019, which now then faced the pandemic, which was the second very strong, very serious shock that also shook the foundations of the public finance. So Ecuador has to be seen with all these things in mind. The end of the oil boom, the decision matrices of policies that were quite expansive, and then a new reality of an oil exporting country facing the challenge of a drop in revenue, and then a pandemic that disadjusted the whole dynamics. That 10-year process of adapting the economy to the new realities also includes a very interesting period during which a program with the IMF concludes with some special foundations so that the public finances can have a better institutionality. And then there's a series of conditions in 20 to 23 where one feels that the fiscal adjustment was sufficient, that we'd reached the goals, added to the political instability, and then some problems with the decision making, especially in the energy sector. And all these events, again, at the end of last year, places Ecuador in an important imbalance. So one of the important results that we get from this is the fact that the public finance managers cannot relax to reach the fiscal sustainability levels. It doesn't mean that it's a permanent condition in time, that you need additional things. You need forecasts. You need to generate different risk scenarios to consider policy alternatives. And as a result, in this very short time, since November to April, Ecuador has had to announce many strong fiscal policy measures, especially on the side of the revenue. So the fiscal program in Ecuador currently must continue with that adaptation process in the Ecuadorian economy, with an additional challenge, which is that there are more and more outside shocks and even deeper shocks, and the spillover is stronger. And of course, I think that's the context that we've started this idea of a fiscal problem to rebuild the buffers and rebuild the need to generate revenue, and above all, generate, to those of us who work in the finance ministry, the obligation of thinking that fiscal sustainability is not a stationary situation. You have to be constantly on top of it. You might feel comfortable in the fiscal exercise, but must not forget that something can happen in 1 or 2 years. And what's more important, if there are negative risks, what policy actions must we take immediately? Very well. Thank you very much, Vice Minister, for this update. And we're working closely with Ecuador to support you in these circumstances. And I'd now like to give the floor to Minister Jonathan Mencos so that he can share his comments with us. Good morning, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm so sorry I'm not there in person to take advantage of the time to talk to other colleagues regarding our continent, and the work that we're doing. We began our government in January 14th this year and have found a fiscal policy that has been known for the past 25 years as very healthy. We have a public debt balance of less than 30%. It's about 27.8% of the GDP. We have a very low tax burden, unfortunately, close to 12% of the GDP, and a public expenditure that closed last year around 13.8% of the GDP. The Guatemalan economy is a very resilient economy. After the COVID crisis in 2020, we've seen economic growth response, allowing us to have about 3.5% growth of the 3.5% of the GDP. In our government plan, we are trying to build a more strategic fiscal policy for development. We believe that we need to increase public expenditure. In fact, part of our government plan, which is being implemented and is under discussion, is precisely in Congress at this time. And what it does is to have a fiscal policy that allows an increase in public expenditures, mainly for investment in economic and social infrastructure where the country has a delay. But today, the public investment means that there may be greater growth and greater job generation. We've agreed with society that we're not going to increase the tax rates at this time, nor create new taxes, because there's still a significant margin in the collection and productivity of our current taxes. we're fighting against evasion and trying to have an increase of the tax base so that one can recognize that the tax authorities must consider all the necessary transactions throughout the country. And insofar as debt is concerned, our social debate has been an increase of 1% point of the GDP. The country's deficit has had about 1.3% a year, which sounds very well if we consider the debt sustainability, but not so good in a country where there are so many public investments that are necessary in schools, in rural roadways, electrification, and so forth. Our main interest is to have the fiscal policy for the next 4 years preserve the sustainability it's had in the last 25 years. But with the strategic use of the debt, we have large investments that we're working on, in fact, with the support of the Inter-American Development Bank, so that we can achieve universal coverage of electric energy, for example, or the extension of a roadway that is strategically important for commercial and productive reasons. And we're also working on a significant increase in the economic infrastructure throughout the country with rural roads and side roads. With the reconfiguration of the fiscal policy, we have worked on an economic growth of around 4.1% to promote the creation of about 1,000 jobs, of course, with strategic management of the fiscal policy, so that we can achieve social stability, governance, and development bases that will allow the country to reach the degree of investment necessary. And I think that we're one step from reaching it, so that we can not only have that seal of guarantee of democracy and transparency and accountability, but the government's vision of collective work with the different actors, so that we can achieve greater economic growth and better development. I must add that one of the most important things we found was the need for transparency and accountability. We found a society that doesn't really trust in the public power for different reasons of corruption. And I think that that is a challenge we're facing, recognizing that the fiscal policy, when being transparent, when allowing the society to trust in it, is important also for democracy and governance. We're about to complete the first 100 days of our administration, and maybe one of the most important tests that what we're doing is right, and that we're doing what we offered society is this extension of the budgetary levels that we're discussing with the different political groups in the Congress, and the possibility of approving financing lines that have been pending in Congress. And I believe that there's greater possibility of approval of these, which will translate in development and welfare for the population. I think that with that, I'll end and hear comments from others. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anabel, and thank you to the IDB for this invitation. My greetings to my colleagues and ministers from Latin America, and a greeting to all of you. I think that when we speak of public financing, almost always we place in the center of our analysis the state itself. In the center of everything, we place the health of the public finances seen from the point of view of the state's priorities, and whether it's going to be able to continue to obtain debts or honor its commitments, its debt commitments. If the state has a sustainable road ahead. And finance ministers, in particular, are concerned with that. However, I think it's always important to complement this from the point of view of the people, the human beings, to place the people in the center of this debate. And I would like to, in my few minutes, change our vision and see it more from the point of view of the Honduran and how we took over on the 22nd of January, and from the point of view of the people in Honduras and what the country has done in these last 3 years. What has been our agenda to improve not only finances seen from the macroeconomic point of view, but seen also from the personal economy? And I'd like to refer to 3 key reforms that have been promoted since 2022. And then one more, which we've talked about with some of you, which we plan to begin in the near future. First, one of the frequently neglected dimensions of the fiscal policy is the revenue. From the beginning of our administration, the president has entrusted us with the task of promoting a tax reform with several characteristics. The first, a tax reform that must not increase taxes. It should not increase the aliquots, nor should it create new taxes. As Jonathan said quite rightly, we have a big space to increase productivity, and in Honduras in particular, that productivity or output is not achieved because of different gaps there are in fiscal benefits and exemptions in Honduras and throughout Latin America. Of all Latin America, is the one that is most forgiving in taxes. We have a 7.7%. We have a tax. It's probably the highest tax forgiveness in all of Latin America, and probably this is because of the different fiscal benefits that there are. There are 18 benefit systems, fiscal systems that are operating in the country currently, all related to, well, theoretically, with the purpose of attracting investment in tourism and export, the textile maquilas, the incentives with renewable energy, and some incentives even related to the thermal generation. We have incentives for transportation as well. We have a number of fiscal benefits and a very high level of tax expenditures. And also, we have an expenditure that is inequitable. It benefits mainly that segment of the population that is the richest segment. When we speak of tax exemptions on the rent, more than 98% of the benefits in direct taxes is received by the highest 10% of the population. When we speak of the exemptions of indirect taxes, more than 40% is that 10%, the richest 10% of the population. So these exceptions of the rules lead to a tremendous inequality in the tax collections, and the state of Honduras, as so many of the Latin American countries, before and after taxes, is not redistributing, and that is a very serious problem, where the state's intervention is not generating the redistribution. And in light of that, the president has sent to Congress the tax justice law, which seeks three things. First, to repeal most of the existing tax systems and create two new fiscal benefit systems with characteristics which we think are virtuous and positive. Second, eliminate all the gaps, the legislative and normative staff gaps that allows that the richest families in the country hide their profits in these fiscal havens, which are located in the region itself. And thirdly, to update the tax law or regulation so that the tax authorities have the necessary tools to follow the money and find it when there is evasion. The first important reform, which has not yet been approved in Congress, but as I said, seen from the point of view of the citizen, since we believe that the work we've done in these 2 years to promote the reform has allowed us to see the inherent injustices of the Honduran tax system, but reinforcing the idea that the lack of legitimacy in the tax systems is, as we've seen traditionally, is not only due to the effectiveness of the public expenditure, but it's also due to a perception of injustice in the collection. So I think that we have advanced substantially, at least openly communicating with the population, with a public debate with society.
Then there are two other important reforms that I should mention. Honduras has the second largest public and private enterprise following IPE in Costa Rica, and it's our power company. It is larger than the second company. It is 4 times larger than the second company when you look at its revenue. Since 1994, it has been going through a gradual privatization process, and the company is now to be sold off in 3 parts: generation, transmission, and distribution. It's already been assessed at a price that, if I told you the price, you would want to set up a cooperative to buy it. And the government has been able to fast track its recovery. Just to mention one of the areas, distribution. It's the part of the company that is in charge of maintaining the low tension part of the grid and also is responsible for billing. Since 1998, the distribution activity had been in the hands of a private company. That private company changed in 2016, and it was only last year in August that the government was able to regain control of that area. And for the first time in 8 years, in December of last year, the company went from a loss situation where we are now at a point where we are reducing technical and non-technical losses. So there's a downward trend. This not only makes the company more stable, but we also hope that in the medium term, it will mean that there will be a rate cut which will benefit the population. So I hope that during the discussion, we have a chance to come back and tell you more about our reform agenda. But if the reforms are connected, because we believe that in order to have good public finances, we first have to take care of the people's finances. Thank you very much, Minister. Minister Clark.
From Jamaica. Let me hand the floor over to you now.
And I missed the question at the beginning.
Okay, I thought you already knew the question. I'm sorry. The question is to share with us an update of the fiscal situation in Jamaica.
Okay. And so, I mean, the backdrop, or the most recent backdrop, would have been 2020, COVID, a 10% economic contraction, like all other countries, the worst in our history. Unemployment shot up, etc. What we did differently from other countries is, like everyone else, we relaxed during 2020 to allow for absorption of the shock and to provide economic and social support. But we tightened earlier than everyone else, started tightening back in 2021, taking the view that it's easier to do so with the wind behind your sails than trying to do so if and when the wind stops blowing as hard. We correctly predicted that the recovery would be strong and fast and ferocious, and therefore tightening that environment would be much more attainable. As such, fast forward to 2024, and our debt, which spiked to 110% of GDP during the COVID crisis, ended March at approximately 72% of GDP. And by next year, we're likely to be in the 60s, which would be the lowest level of debt that Jamaica, if we achieve it, the lowest level of debt Jamaica has had in 50 years. We have been strengthening institutions, recognizing that this can't be left to personalities alone. So we had fiscal rules, which were first implemented in 2010 or strengthened in 2014. We have strengthened those rules again to create an independent fiscal commission, which is an institution that is empowered to monitor and report on Jamaica's compliance with those fiscal rules. Our first fiscal commissioner was just appointed, and in the next fiscal year, that work will begin. The institutional framework has been further strengthened by deepening monetary transparency with the independence of our central bank. Certainly the only country in the Caribbean to have an independent central bank, and only one of few in Latin America and the Caribbean, to have an independent central bank that is focused and empowered by law to pursue low and stable inflation through an inflation targeting framework. We committed to doing so, and then COVID came and we followed through. COVID provided a great excuse not to do it, but we followed through with our commitment, and in the middle of mass unemployment, we followed through with the commitment to make the central bank independent, and lo and behold, the first test they got was this globally induced inflation shock. The central bank responded quickly, and Jamaica is on track to return into the target range. We, with this sort of improved fiscal dynamics, our focus now is to ensure, let's talk about the expenditure side, and I'll go back to the revenue side, to ensure that we can increase the public investment envelope in our country. The improved macro-fiscal statistics are necessary, but they're not the destination or an end in themselves. The ultimate end is to improve quality of life, and we can only do so sustainably through improved quality of public investments that can deliver better transportation, water, sewage, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals to the Jamaican people. And the challenge that we face now is to ensure that the public bureaucracy can accommodate and increase pipeline of public investment projects, that we can have the project preparation facilities to bring those to market, and that we can have the technical resources that can deal with the scale of the transformation there that we require. On the expenditure side, we also face a challenge in being the largest speaking English country south of the United States. What that means for us is that the labor market is for skills. There's no separation between Jamaica and North America as for skilled people. Right? It's a very fluid market. People can leave, skilled people can leave very easily. The migration, by comparison, out of Central America and Mexico is very different. The migration, as I understand it, and as I think the IDB came up with a paper, or the World Bank came with a paper recently on migration, migration is mostly unskilled people who leave. For us, it's mostly skilled people who leave. And that poses a particular challenge for government, for the public bureaucracy in maintaining the technical resources that we need to run the country. As such, we had to engage in a public compensation restructuring exercise, which had the effect of increasing public compensation as a share of GDP. But that comes after an unusual compression in public compensation because of our consolidation efforts, where in real terms, public sector wages declined, were 60% of what they were over a 10-year period. And so the adjustment has come, but the adjustment has come not as an increase, but as a restructuring of public sector compensation to ensure that we simplify the structure and the levels are such to induce, hopefully, greater retention of the skills and the talent that we need to run the public bureaucracy. So the other element for us that has been, of focus and key is a program of divestments to move assets that can be better utilized in the private sector and to harness those resources for other purposes. On the revenue side, we have engaged in continuous changes in our revenue makeup by removing sort of distortionary taxes that yield revenue but have the potential to distort the incentives in the economy. We had things like minimum business taxes and asset taxes for non-financial businesses, which we found stymied the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit in terms of new people starting out, young companies and so forth. And we abolished and got rid of those. We had transaction taxes on real estate transactions, which you paid whether or not the transaction resulted in a profit or not. We got rid of those. And that kind of tax reform has yielded huge activity, both in terms of we have the largest number of companies being formed in the country, each year over the past few years, including the COVID year, has been a record year. More companies being formed than the year before. And we have had, a large sort of increase in construction since we made those tax reforms. On the income side, Jamaica has been moving towards indirect taxation as opposed to direct taxation, and only less than 30% of people in Jamaica actually pay income tax. The number might be more like 25% because the threshold is set at a level that is quite a bit above the per capita GDP. So there's usually a relationship between your per capita income and your income tax threshold. I think we would have one of the highest ratios in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our threshold, if I can do it quickly. Our threshold is nearly twice as high as our per capita GDP. Not quite twice, it might be 1.7 times our per capita GDP, which is higher than most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the Jamaica is in a sort of very interesting sort of place in our fiscal trajectory, having improved our macro fiscal fundamentals to certainly the numbers are better than they have been for 50 years in every single metric that you can sort of macroeconomic metric that one can look at. And the key now is to make sure that this can deliver more for people, because that's the only way in which it can be sustained, for people to see that these reforms and these results ultimately are in the interest of people. For the future, we have to consider the change in ways in which people consume and the global digital economy, the fact that people consume a lot outside of the country that escapes the tax net. I know various countries have made various arrangements as far as digital taxation and so forth is concerned. Those are things that we are going to have to consider in the future. By consider, I don't mean do. I mean, certainly this is not these are not characteristics that have defined life before. And I'm saying that it's something that is going to need to be thought about at least. So, I'll sort of end with the sharing that, Jamaica, with these improved dynamics on as I said, the lowest debt in 50 years, highest level of foreign exchange in our history, lowest unemployment ever, and the highest number of persons employed at any time in our history. We ran a current account surplus for the first time in 30 years. Now, current account deficit is not necessarily bad, but just as a statistic. And in November, Jamaica issued its first local currency bond in international capital markets, which for us is a huge achievement, and one that we hope heralds a new era for Jamaica.
Thank you very much, Minister. And indeed, I think that Jamaica's progress in this area is very well recognized by the multilateral development banks, including the IDB. So let me turn now al ministro Fernández de Paraguay, por favor, para una actualización sobre las cosas en Paraguay.
From Paraguay for an update on Paraguay's situation. And Abel, thank you. First of all, I'm very glad to be here with my colleagues on this panel. Thank you to the IDB. Let me start by saying that we're in 2024. It's amazing. 4 years after the largest shock I think we've ever had in economic, social, and health terms. I think that the time has come, I would say, to stop thinking of what is urgent in the short term, and start thinking of what is really important, what is more structural, what we can do in the medium and long term. And that's a major shift. We've left the emergency behind, the emergency we had in 2020, and we can go back to this conversation. We can especially go back to implementing policies that are going to improve the quality of life of our people. And I fully agree with others in that is what is most important about any public policy, and especially so in the case of fiscal policies. Clearly, it's been an exceptional period, and fiscal policies have also been exceptional during this time. But we know that it would not be sustainable to try to stay on this track. We need to tackle fiscal challenges. we need to go back to a more normal fiscal situation. And that is where we begin. We need to start thinking how to do that. There's thousands of papers, some have been published by the IDB itself, trying to figure out what is the best path to achieve the fiscal reforms we need. Whether it's by raising taxes or cutting expenditures, we know that both can have effects that can lead to a recession. So policymakers have to choose the option that is going to have less of an impact on economic activity. Even though it's been 4 years, our economic growth has not yet been fully consolidated. So we need to be careful as to how we adjust. We need to find the right dosage or strike the right balance. We don't want to impede the recovery or jeopardize what some countries have achieved, but at the same time, we want to keep our fiscal policy credible, something we cannot do without a bold or firm fiscal consolidation, or if that fiscal consolidation takes too long. So against that backdrop, what are we doing in Paraguay? And I'd like to borrow the words of the minister who said that it's important to put our elements in order: spending, revenue, and deficit. As you know, we in Paraguay have a simple tax regime, 10-10-10. So 10 is corporate income tax, 10 personal income tax, and 10% is our value-added tax. Some people say that these taxes are too low. In our case, they're quite competitive because ultimately it's the private sector that's going to generate jobs that are going to make the economy grow. But having said that, this puts us in a situation wherein we need to improve our spending, and I'll speak about that later. But let me tell you what we've done with this 10-10-10 structure. Until last year, we had two tax collection agencies. One worked on customs with the General Customs Direction, and the other was under the Ministry of Finance. It was called the Undersecretary of Taxation, and they were responsible for collecting domestic taxes. Two agencies with two heads, each one wanting to be king of their own kingdom. So that was not very efficient. So we created one agency consolidating the two with one director, one way of thinking, huge synergies generated by bringing the two agencies together, in addition to free flow of information where everything was in one place. So there were costs because reforms always come at a cost. There were some embedded interest, but it's been a good thing. In the past, over the past 3 months, we've increased collection by 19% in nominal terms. And I don't know if my colleagues from Argentina are listening. I hope they won't take this badly. It's not with an inflation of 110%. It's with an inflation rate of 3.2%. So that means 16% in real terms. In March, we had a lower collection level because there were 5 days less, because it was Holy Week in March. The year before it had been in April, but because we had Easter and Holy Week, the collection level is lower. Now in April, we're at 30% higher than in the past. So there's much to be gained by consolidating agencies and by having one single tax policy. And that is what we've been able to achieve with this 10-10-10. Plus, we have been using innovative revenue sources without having to change our tax system. And I'll mention two things very quickly. First, we enacted a carbon credit law. 44% of our territory is forests. Most of these are native forests, and many of those native forests are in the hands of the state because they are national parks. but such a valuable asset cannot remain untapped. We can contribute to the environment, but at the same time, we can also find monetary benefits. So the law was enacted. It applies to the private sector primarily, but the public sector will be able to receive carbon credits, and that will be another important source of revenue for the state. Another innovative tax, I think you all know Itaipu. It's the largest electric power generator in the world. It's clean and renewable energy. But we're in talks with Brazil in order to find the way we are using Itaipu so that it's not just a source of clean and renewable energy, a generator, but that it can also serve as an engine that will drive growth and development in both countries. It will be a source of financing for many of the programs we have. So I'll stop there as far as revenue goes and move to spending. The IDB knows this well. In 2019, I think you launched the idea of spending better. There's a portion of 4.1% of GDP is not spent efficiently in the region. And Paraguay, I believe that figure is 3.9% of GDP. There's plenty of room for improvement. When I talk about taxes in Paraguay, it's not that we lack resources, but more that the resources are not spent judiciously. President Peña and I don't believe that we can ask people to pay more if we're not spending the resources we have well. It's important to make sure that government programs are effective when it comes to spending. There's a lot to be done. We have clear priorities for health, education, security, and also for social transfers for those who truly are unable to have decent jobs for whatever reason. One key thing we've done is to start to implement a new public hiring law, which is going to be much more transparent. We hope it's also more effective and will lead us down the path of better spending. If the Ministry of the Economy buys this glass, it costs $1. If the Ministry of Health buys this glass, it costs $1.75. Why? There's no reason to justify this. It's the same glass, and we should be paying the same price. But because the law would not allow for bidding procedures for both institutions, and I'm using the glass as an example, but I should be speaking about medications. Just last week, we signed an interinstitutional agreement with a number of agencies, Central Bank, the executive. There's 5 different agencies that are going to be responsible for implementing this new law. We believe that with that, we will be improving the way we spend our citizens' money. So let's end talking about the fiscal deficit. I think all the countries of the region, perhaps minus Mexico, that has a strong counter-cyclical policy, we have not stayed within the reasonable limits when it comes to our fiscal deficit. So we need to do what I mentioned before, find a balance, not impede the recovery, but find a way to balance our fiscal policy. We have defined a convergence. We have the maximum limit under our fiscal responsibility law, which dates back to 2013. And by 2026, we should reach a level of 1.5 for the deficit. Where are we now? For 2023, we ended at 4.1%. And that's because we paid some arrearages dating back to the pandemic. It's a very high number, but these were one-time expenditures, so they will not be recurring this year. We hope to close this year at 2.6, and this is in keeping with the fiscal responsibility law maximum limits. And for the first 3 months of the year, that 4.1 will become 3.6. So there's an adjustment of 0.5 of GDP. So that's in only 3 months. It may seem high, but we have not seen any impact on economic activity. We have gained when it comes to credibility. So the private sector is investing and spending with greater confidence. So the flip side of that is debt and borrowings. And what we're doing is using innovative mechanisms. We don't, it's not that we don't want to keep borrowing from the IDB, but we want to borrow in a more innovative way. So we signed an agreement with BID Klima, IDB Weather. I believe that there we are going to be focusing on nature-friendly loans. We also have an RSF with the IMF. So we're not putting all our eggs in the same basket. We're diversifying the sources we are using to finance our deficit. And what I think has been most important during this period is that we've been able to access the market in New York, but not to issue bonds because we, since 2013, have been issuing our own bonds without any issues. But this was the first time we issued bonds in local currency with not with a rate of 10, 12, or 15. It's been a 7-year bond with a rate of 7.9%, and it was oversubscribed significantly. And this means that today, that 7-year bond is yielding 7.15% because pricing has gone up. But more important than that is that we are looking for innovative ways to fund our deficit. And I think that is important for all countries. We need to find new sources of financing. So once again, these are challenging times. We need to adjust our fiscal policy, and we should not forget to tell our colleagues in the government that what the president has said to us very clearly, there is no money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your words. I find it interesting to hear you all and see how each one in your own realities are trying to find a way to recover the external shocks that have affected the countries in different ways. Yeah, but all intensely with a view to improve the quality of life of the citizens through important adjustments of revenue or expenditures and with innovative ways. I would like now to ask all of you the following. The economies are facing a slowdown for 2024. How do you gain fiscal space to promote growth without losing the progress attained in fiscal concentration? I'll go backwards. I'll give Carlos the floor first now. Well, I'm going to have serious problems trying to answer your question because for Paraguay, 2024 is going to be a year of a 4% growth of the GDP. So it's difficult for me to think of what I'm going to do to gain fiscal space when actually the economy is growing. But I'm going to try to think theoretically what would have happened in Paraguay had we had a slowdown. And basically, the same. The global economy is slowing down. Yes, yes. Those are the typical challenges of recovery that is going to continue to be very cyclic, where the growth rate of the global economy is probably far below what it had been in the past. If you look at the figures now, the bar is lower and lower. And instead of going down and continuing, we continue to go down. And that sooner or later is going to affect everyone because we're not an island in Paraguay. It's going to affect us through Brazil or through Argentina. And finally, it's going to reach us in Paraguay. And the internal motors would have to be developed in such a way, because externally we're not going to get any help. But I'm going to emphasize the same thing again. There are two things there. The state doesn't have money in itself. It's the private sector that has the money. So if the private sector is doing okay, the government is going to be okay. So it's useless for us to try to do something different when the private sector is not doing well. And secondly, I think that I'm going to give you some of the figures of Paraguay, but I think it's the same for all countries. In Paraguay, 50% is 15% is public sector and 85% is private. So there are certain things that the fiscal policies can do to strengthen the growth, but it's the private sector that has to generate the economic sustainable growth. The public sector can have a countercyclical policy of a year or two, but then it loses momentum if it continues. So we need 4 years after the pandemic to see what we can do internally so that the private sector that's there can begin to trust again, despite the fact that we're seeing pretty gray clouds around us, and they start consuming and investing. And I think that the credibility in the fiscal policy is key here. If the private sector that we have doubts that we're doing more than we can, then I think they're not going to be able to trust us, and they're not going to consume or invest. It's a pretty challenging game here, and we have to really begin to gain this trust from the private sector and not expect miracles. The public sector is not going to create any miracles if the private sector is not with us. So, especially at this difficult global moment, we have to clearly understand the transition of a sustainable fiscal deficit and help the private sector be the ones who can actually generate employment and economic growth. Thank you very much, Carlos. Minister Clark?
Your thoughts on how to support growth in a context of deceleration of the global economy while retaining the benefits of fiscal consolidation?
Welcome to our world. We find from our experience that maintaining a predictable policy environment has tremendous spin-off benefit. During the COVID crisis, the first case in Jamaica was March 2020, and by June of 2020, we had produced a sort of 100-page document that outlined how we were going to address the crisis, including the principles that would govern policymaking during that time. We set out that, for example, we would favor intervention on the expenditure side and not on the revenue side, because we want the cost to be transparent. We said we preferred rules-based approaches. We preferred market solutions to government intervention, and set out a number of principles. And what we found from an experience is that though we knew we're going to go into a certain decline, the plans of the private sector did not stop, which meant that as soon as the storm reversed, we just picked up from where we left off in a very, with a lot of momentum. Yeah. And that resulted in a sort of a unique experience where Jamaica, certainly at the end of 2022, would have been the only country in the hemisphere, I believe, with the exception of Guyana that discovered oil, that could say that GDP output was higher than prior to COVID, unemployment was lower than prior to COVID, and at the same time, debt was lower than prior to COVID. So I say that to say, and that's what we did facing a huge storm. So what you're describing to me, the scenario you're describing is one that I would apply the same approach, which is to maintain a stable policy outlook, because ultimately what that says to the private sector is that when this little storm passes, we'll be able to pick up from where we left off. I say all of that to say that our fiscal rules target a particular debt objective by a particular date, and in our case, that date is March of 2028. And it means that, we pursue our fiscal targets with a level of seriousness. Doesn't mean we'll always hit them, but it means if we don't, we have to make adjustments. So faced with that situation, which I hope is hypothetical for us, like Paraguay says it is for them, we'd have to just make adjustments. Because to not do so would mean that you not only suffer in the current time frame, but you also suffer in the future time frame, because private agents will adjust their plans if they believe that unsustainability is creeping in.
Thank you, Minister. I think both of you have referred to this stable policy outlook and credibility of policies as a key element in this context, right? Ministro Ochoa,
Minister Ochoa, your thoughts? Well, in Honduras, we saw a debt growth from 2009 to 2022 of over 500%. We went from having a total public debt of $3 billion in 2009 to close to $20 billion in 2022. And we started the government with a big question, is where did that money go? There were no public investments, at least not meaningful. There was a deficient social investment, and the public infrastructure we saw was like that. And we think that that has to do with the effectiveness of the expenditure. Well, said in diplomatic terms, said politically, it has to do with the corruption. From 2009 to 2022, the Honduran society was seeing levels of corruption in the government in the different states that, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk about the predictability of policies in time, because our government only started with a very ambitious reform agenda. And depending on who you ask, the answers may always say that it was too radical. But, for example, this is one of the measures that I'd like to talk about, which is that in 2022, we found a situation in the government which not even in the most adventurous pamphlets could we have even imagined one could privatize, which was the public decision of what to invest in. The decision of how to use the public expenditure was privatized through trusts. In the country, there were 84 trust funds that were in the private banking, in 16 private banks, and the technical committees of these trust funds, which were in the private banks, were the ones who decided what was done with the public budget. Just so that we understand, these are trust funds that were fed by the public budget or from the taxes of roadway or safety receipts that were autonomous, had privatized the sphere of exception of what to do. with the public money. In May of 2022, all of these trust funds were repealed, and the Finance Secretariat began liquidation and auditing process of all these public trusts, which, on the one hand, allowed us to control the public and social investment programs. But on the other hand, we also, through the audits that we performed, see why in the past decades they chose to follow that type of system. When we analyze what were the purchasing and hiring processes, one can clearly conclude what the objective was. The use of these public funds in these trusts, which are public-private corruption tools, which followed no procedure. The procedure was simply that the technical committee of the trust fund would speak to any company and have them provide the services. And one would think that the purchasing and hiring laws of the state were deficient in many ways, and that allocation process like that might be able to obtain more efficient prices. But in fact, when we analyze the prices and we compared them to the market prices, we realized that they were way above what was being offered in the market. Simple things like the example that the minister gave us, where the difference wasn't just 25 cents. The purchase with the hiring was at $1, and the one that they bought was at 10. So we have been overcoming those obstacles insofar as the efficiency of the public expenditure, and overcoming those types of strategies, which in fact are strategies that promote the public-private corruption that has existed in our country. And what that has led to, coming back to the question that you asked, is looking for fiscal spaces. In the case of Honduras, it's been with the taking over again the decision of the public-private investment. In the budget of 2024 this year, we have a public investment program, a public and social investment program of close to 11% of the GDP, about $4 billion, translated into 8 new hospitals, close to 1,200 new beds, 4 new multipurpose dams of electric energy generation, flood contention, and irrigation, a historical consideration for roadways, about 1,300 kilometers of roads, and a very ambitious housing financing program, aside from the social assistance program with conditional cash transfers designed by the government. It would be impossible for us to find that fiscal space to do the public investments had the government not insisted on the necessary reforms to recover the public control of the decisions of what to do with the public funds. Thank you very much, Minister. Minister Mencos, you've been listening virtually there. I'd like to hear from you. Could you share your opinions with us? Yes, thank you very much. Guatemala also has a healthy economy right now. We have a growth expectation of about 3.5%. I mean, it's not going to be a bad year for us. Of course, the government has a very clear idea of having to promote a sustainable economic growth so that it won't fall depending on the international situation. It has to be a sustainable economic growth where we're able to care for the natural environment and the people in the midst of the production efforts. And of course, an inclusive economic growth, so that what we're actually doing becomes employment and certainty, not only for those who invest privately, but even for the workers themselves. We forget the idea that there's an invisible hand that is going to help everything and fix everything, and that the public power is not significant in an economy. No, on the contrary, we believe that the public power can determine the levels of economic growth and development pathways that can be shared with the private actors, be they national or foreign investors, as well as with society as a whole. So the big challenge is that the workers of the 21st century should feel close to the economic model that's being implemented. And in this case, we feel that despite the 3.5% growth, we must be able to create the necessary conditions for that growth in time. We are proposing, as I said before, strategic investments capable of creating a greater potential medium-term growth and economic dynamism in the short run. The rural roads I mentioned, the efforts of rural electrification, and even other efforts in Central American roadways or support to trade and national large-scale production. And of course, the challenge of investment in water and sanitation, which are dual dividend actions. We call them like that. This is a country that has so many gaps to close in social investments that allows us to bet on the idea that in these 4 years, the economic growth be more dynamic with investments like these. Of course, there are investments that must also mark the public power doing things right. Like, for example, the work we're doing to build 2 metro lines in the metropolitan area in the city of Guatemala, the housing fund to begin to have another long-term economic cycle with endogenous variables whereby we're able to continue to allow the growth to have that momentum. And we're working so that in the next budget we can include a national fund for innovation and productive transformation, because we do need private investment, of course, but we need private investment for the 21st century, where we promote the existence of more knowledge, more added value, and of course, more successful international participation. We're clear that either we make the Guatemalan economy become a receptor of international and national private investments, or the Guatemalans are going to end up going towards the areas where these investments are taking place. The country has the potential for economic growth. We're working on it. And the only thing I have to underscore is that our president has had a series of conversations in Europe as well as in the United States, which will result in the possibility of greater investments focusing on what the government wishes to develop in the country, which is the economy. And I'll end with what I began. Sustainable economic growth, sustainable and inclusive, because it's the road towards full democracy. Thank you very much, Minister. Vice Minister, I'll give you the floor, but you can add one final question, which I'd like to ask all of you in 1 minute, and that is, in that global context of each one of your countries, what else can we do to support here at the IDB, to support the work you're doing? Thank you, Annabelle. Well, for the Ecuadorian economy, this is going to be a year of many challenges. We don't have the strength, we don't have the necessary economic growth drag projected for this year. There are many things that came in so that the growth this year will be relatively low. And the challenge of having to solve the problems of the popular consultation that we had last year for the oil extraction and what we should do with that. Of course, the country's orientation in this readjustment of the economic forces or objectives suggests also that it's not just the state that can promote the growth with all the momentum. The private sector has to participate as well. And that brings us to two specific things. First, being able to generate market aperture for the economic sectors that have the exporting potential, which has been one of the first ideas, which is quite significant, where we've already signed some trades. The shrimp for us is a star sector, which can teach us a lot on how to become part of the global economy. Even in the pandemic times, they found a commercial opportunity to change the way in which they reach the markets. And I think that this is an experience that Ecuador can take advantage of and continue to promote, aside from the fact that the slowdown of the economy is present. The second has to do with how to protect the internal demand. And the public sector, in the case of Ecuador, there has two very clear lines of action. First, to work to ensure that the circuit of the fiscal policy not drag the private sector on the lags and the delays in the payments and so forth. And I think that that's one of the things that the government has to continue to do at this time. One of the objectives is to be more up to date with the private sector in the payments and improve the paying up the past obligations. This is very important because in that way there will be a better flow of deposits in the financial sector. And this is something which for us is very important at this time. And it's where we focused most of our current management to see how we can help the private sector strengthen its position again vis-a-vis the pending collections and project itself in other directions. Minister, excuse me for interrupting you, but we have very little time. Can you give us in very few words, just less than a minute, how can the IDB support you? Well, for Ecuador, the work with all the multilaterals is very important, especially with the IDB, because we have an important trajectory and a portfolio of interesting products. What's important is to see how we can connect all of the specific work or infrastructure to improve the lives of the people with all the projects that are in operation. So maintaining these open lines of financing is very important for us to generate the interaction with the subnational governments as well is very important. And to have a long-term relationship with the climate change policies. That's a very interesting approach as well. Thank you very much, Vice Minister. Minister Mencos, what else can we do to support Guatemala? Well, thank you very much for your question. To help us close the enormous gaps we still have. We're already working with you in the electrical power, the building of the important roadway, and the technical support in all the efforts that we're making to make our financial management systems more mature, to have a better understanding of the efficiency we need to show society in the expenditure and public investments. Thank you for the support you're already giving us. Thank you, Minister. Minister Ochoa, well, aside from the work that we're already doing, I think the IDB is an excellent platform for us, not only for the financing management, but for the design of public policies and our ways to consider the effectiveness of these. I believe that in 10 years, we will be back here talking to, well, maybe with less shyness, let's say, of the way in which we're speaking about the industrial policies, where many countries, I believe, will come back to this. And I think that's where the IDB can help. Since, I mean, Eric is leading a tremendous team of thinkers there on different topics. And I think that the IDB could be that for Latin America. And in a second dimension, with IDB Lab and the IDB Best, we personally would be very interested in having the IDB help us design investment public-private investment systems for the private sector capable of being fair for the people we represent. That would be, we have a very poor experience there, and I think that the IDB could be very helpful in that respect to help us use the public and private investments. Thank you, Minister Ochoa.
What more can we do for Jamaica? I'm afraid to ask the question.
We just have to implement the program we've agreed. I think we have a fantastic lineup of programs, innovation in the private sector, helping us to unlock an entrepreneurial and innovative spirit and having that ecosystem being embedded in the country. We are at an interesting point in our trajectory. The IDB has been a tremendously important source of public financing for Jamaica over the past decade, without which we wouldn't have gotten here. Given where we are now, over the next period, we don't necessarily see, an appetite for increasing, the public financing sort of envelope. Clearly, there'll be renewals, so we're not talking about paying down, but there'll be renewals. We'll probably keep it at around the same level. But the need now is to ensure that the private sector can be dynamic and innovative and creative. And to that end, we're very happy with the agreements reached for the capital increase in IDB Invest and in IDB Labs. And so for us, IDB, let's just implement the fantastic portfolio opportunities that we have.
Great, thank you very much. Carlos, la última palabra.
Sí, consistente con lo que dije anteriormente.
Yes, as I said before, and as countries can access financing at better terms, better tenors and interest rates, I think that the IDB should shift and our focus should be more on the private sector side, IDB Invest and IDB Lab, because that's where access is not as good. We don't have the same access as we do on the sovereign's side. Now I've told James, you have no more excuses. You've got the money, so I want to see you on the ground in Paraguay. But with growth forecast of 3.2%, I would say we have to be careful. We need to be careful. We should reserve our fiscal space, our fiscal policy space for when we really need it. I don't think we should go overboard. I think those were very good final comments. I thank all panelists for joining us for this discussion. I thank Eric and his team for organizing, and to you, our audience, for being here with us.